So welcome everybody. Thank you all for being virtually present today for the second event of the 10th edition of the Global Annual Energy Meeting we co-organize with Esade and InnoEnergy. It is with great pleasure that we, the Commission, see that we are now at the 10th edition as we consolidate our fruitful collaboration with EsadeGeo Center. And thanks, of course, to Javier Solana, thanks to Ángel Saz. The first event last Friday gathered more than 250 people and included very to-the-point discussions with Vice President Rivera and our Commission Executive Vice President Timmermans. As you perfectly know, the first political priority of the EU Commission, and especially for this von der Leyen Commission since 2019, is the EU Green Deal, and our commitment in terms of the different legislative pieces on all areas and economic sectors is crystal clear. This started off with our first EU climate law, setting very concrete targets and obligations for all member states. And it continues with the deployment of the Fit for 55 package and all related actions, measures, and regulations across all sectors and economic activities. Any relevant transformation in the economy entails risks. Risks are always linked with opportunities, that's clear. And now we are confronted with a massive transition as a result of the green roadmap in Europe and worldwide, and the transition to clean energies. The last developments as regards energy markets, its functioning and sources of supply have pointed to some emerging risks. We never said that this transition is cost-free. To be successful, we need to tackle social and economic costs of the transition. And of course, in Europe, over the last 30 years, we have proved that we can effectively combine energy transition and economic growth. Greenhouse gas emissions in the European Union were reduced by 23% between 1990 and 2016, while the economy grew by 53% over the same period. As said by our Executive Vice President Timmermans, the transition will be just, or there will be no transition. This is the reason why the Commission accompanies climate targets with a huge amount of investments from the EU budget first, and from the 750 billion of the Resilience and Recovery Plan, which is indeed complementary to private investments, including, and this is very important, a climate social fund. Over the next hour, more or less, we have a big challenge. On one side, to underline all the risks ahead, geopolitical risks, very pertinent these days, energy costs and social costs, those on the way we fund the transition, hence linked to the financial sector, security risks, raw materials, etc., and to propose
Yes. So today, hopefully, we will learn some responses to key questions, such as, are we sufficiently equipped to fund the transition? What are the implications of this process at geopolitical level? Do we have enough solutions to address the social and employment risks related to this energy transition? How can the EU ensure the supply of the raw materials it needs for the transition? And finally, and it is very important as well, are citizens and businesses sufficiently on board? Are they factoring all these risks? Indeed, we have a panel of high-level and top speakers. We are looking forward to listening to all of your interventions. And thank you very much on our side from the Commission. And now the floor is yours, Marie. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lucas, for this introduction and for your support for the event as well. So without further ado, let's get our webinar started. I'm Marie van Andries, I'll be your moderator for this webinar today. And it really is a pleasure to be moderating this second panel of our Global Annual Energy Meeting. The title of our panel today is Derisking the Energy Transition, Energy Security Amid Traditional and New Risks. And as Lucas said, any relevant transformation in the economy does entail risks. In this particular transition, we are moving from one energy system to another. And so we'll need to deal with the risks that we already know and that we've been dealing with for years, while simultaneously addressing new ones. Dealing with all these risks together And ensuring energy security is really critical for the success of the energy transition, the route to carbon neutrality that the EU is embarking on. So to discuss this truly critical topic, we are thrilled to have with us today a fantastic set of speakers, all from different sectors, who are going to give us their expert views from the inside on some of these risks in this journey. Let me introduce them to you, and I'll start with Lucas Aranguena. Lucas is the Global Head of ESG and Sustainable Tech at Santander Corporate and Investment Banking. He's also a board member there, and he's responsible for advising clients globally in their energy transition. I'll also introduce our next panelist, Maria Ostrand. She is the Vice President for Cathode Active Material, which is a business area within Northvolt covering the procurement of raw materials, as well as process and material development of cathode active materials. Our next panelist is Lei Hancher. She is Professor of European Law at the University of Tilburg, but also part-time professor at the Florence School of Regulation within the European University Institute, where she directs the area on energy union law. Our next panelist is Ture Sekenes. He is the Program Director for the EBA, the European Battery Alliance, at InnoEnergy Scandinavia. He joined InnoEnergy in 2019, and he is responsible for developing the European battery industry. And our final panelist, last but not least, I see him with us, is Marco Sidi. He is Senior Research Fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, and also Montalcini, Assistant Professor at the University of Cagliari in Italy. As you can see, we have really a stellar panel with us. Thank you to everyone for being with us today. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of ground to cover and really in depth from each of your areas of expertise. So we'll get started in just a minute with our first round of interventions, but let me also take the occasion to welcome once again our audience. We are thrilled to have you with us, and we will be accepting questions towards the end of this panel, so please feel free to send those in via the YouTube chat. We will be happy to take them later on. Okay, let's get started. So in our first round of interventions, I have asked each speaker to bring us their strategic view from their respective area of expertise. And so each of them will analyze for us in 5 minutes a specific risk or risk category in the energy transition. And they will also reflect on what the EU, and by this I mean the EU institutions, its firms, its member states, can do to mitigate these risks. So we'll go through this first set of interventions, and we'll be starting with Marco Sidi for the geopolitical angle. Marco, could you tell us what you see as the major geopolitical risks of the energy transition for the EU, and what the EU should do in this particular context?
Thank you very much for your introduction, Marie. And indeed, I will start with perhaps the background of what we have now and what the risks are as we move ahead with the energy transition. Geopolitical risk that's inherent to the transition in Europe is the decreasing commercial trade relations with the traditional fossil fuel providers of the European Union. So partners such as Algeria and Russia. So with the transition, the existing economic interdependence will decrease. And this has two main consequences. One, at the international level, is that conflict might become more likely because there's less economics binding the two sides together. And the second one relates to the domestic budgets of the partners, which are disproportionately dependent on fossil fuel exports. And this might lead to domestic instability with potential spillovers across the borders and hence also in the European Union. Now, if we take these two cases, Algeria and Russia, we can talk about different levels of exposure. For example, in the case of Russia, Russia is actually tendentially more competitive in terms of fossil fuel exports. So it's likely to remain competitive even as markets shrink during the next decades due to the energy transition. Russia has some alternatives. It can export, for example, liquefied natural gas to Asia, so it can differentiate. I would say that in the European neighborhood, countries such as Algeria are even more exposed to geopolitical risks, because Algerian exports are more oriented towards the European Union, which will decarbonize earlier than other parts of the globe, according to current plans. It has less foreign reserves, so less money to invest in the energy transition, and this is why the EU is called upon to play a particular role here. And it also has a younger population with greater risks, let's say, related to unemployment and the social cost of losing these revenues. So the question is, how can we de-risk this conundrum? It is very important that already now the European Union starts to concentrate on transforming the energy trade with fossil fuel providers towards a more green and sustainable trade. And this means investing more in renewable projects in the partner countries, energy efficiency, hydrogen. And if we look at the EU level, there are especially two documents or policy plans that are of special relevance. One you have mentioned already is the European Green Deal, which has an external dimension, develops partnerships with third countries. So this is the plain field. The other one is a more recent document or policy area, and it's the so-called Global Gateway. So an EU connectivity plan to develop new connections with other countries, and these are also energy connections. So this is, for example, this could provide room for new hydrogen connections with countries such as Algeria, Russia, and others. Besides public funding, and this is my last point for now, the EU should also try to find innovative ideas of financing, of supporting finance for the energy transition in current fossil fuel providers. For example, one possibility could be to reinvest the funding raised from the carbon border adjustment mechanism for investments in the green sector in the partner countries. So, for example, if you tax Russian products because they are impactful on climate, in terms of climate change, then you could alleviate tensions with Russia related to the CBAM by reusing those funds for green investments in the Russian Federation. Okay, these are my initial points, and I stop here.
Thanks so much, Marcos. I've written down a few points to talk about later, especially the point that not all fossil fuel producers in the EU's region are alike, and so certainly the EU will need to adjust its responses. And thank you also for pointing out a few of the avenues already towards mitigating these risks. So I noted down the partnerships in the European Green Deal, the Global Gateway, as well as innovative financing. And thank you also for connecting to the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which we will actually be discussing later on in our event. In Thursday's event, we have a specific panel related to this. So thanks for these initial remarks. We'll come back to you in just a moment, but let me switch now to our second speaker. And our second speaker is Lei Hancher. So we're moving here from geopolitics to a related topic. Essentially, it's about energy price fluctuations and how energy and electricity market regulations might be able to mitigate some of the risks of the energy transition. A complex topic, which I know that Lei will be able to help us with. So Lei, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the kind invitation to speak today on this fascinating topic. Now, first of all, I have to emphasize I'm a lawyer, and the questions on how to reform price control and the way we have designed electricity markets, especially in Europe, raise a lot of economic as well as legal questions. And so there might also be other panelists today who are even more qualified to talk on those issues than I am. So as a lawyer, looking at the current debate, of course, we're starting from a bit of a shock to the system. If we look at the extent to which gas prices rose last year, some 400% from spring of 2021 up to October. 400% is a massive increase. And that, of course, had a knock-on effect, leading to a 200% rise in electricity prices. The Commission responded with a so-called toolbox, sort of guidance to member states to how to react to this, and instructed the regulator, ACER, to report on whether or not further market reforms in the electricity sector might be necessary. And we're expecting a report from ACER in approximately 2 months, in April of this year. So the regulation as it stands, of course, in Europe, requires member states to liberalize wholesale gas and electricity prices. So in principle, there should be no restrictions on the prices at which gas and electricity is sold in the wholesale markets. Whereas when it comes to retail pricing, the legal situation has never been totally clear. Many member states continue, in fact, to impose some sort of retail price caps or to ensure consumer protection, especially for vulnerable customers, so that, in fact, you have certain countries where there are quite restrictive price caps that have stopped competition really evolving in those national markets. So we're starting from a position that's a little bit fuzzy from a legal point of view. And what we're seeing is that the efforts and the commentary is really concentrating on wholesale market reform, because it's here that several member states, including Spain, but also Italy, have been putting forward proposals for fairly radical wholesale market reform and for introducing quite radical reforms to what we call the target model for the electricity sector. And I think it's important to remember that much of the market design is based on short-term contracts, short-term trading, and we've moved away systematically from long-term contracts, which we've seen as always being detrimental to competition. So although legally such contracts are not they're not banned, they're discouraged in many ways. And what's very interesting going forward when we move from the current crisis and what we can learn from this crisis and how to regulate prices to the Green Deal, to the energy transition, of course, we have to also question whether or not we need long-term contracts to get us through the transition, to give us the stability for consumers, but also for investors to invest in those markets, or whether we want to retain this price volatility that we have seen in the last 6 months. Because price volatility is, of course, in itself an important signal to consumers, whether they're large or small, to think about their electricity and gas demand, to think about their energy demand and how they can lower that or make that demand more flexible. And what's really going to be key going forward, I think, to reforming the wholesale market design, if that is the chosen route we go, or if we look towards new ways of protecting so-called vulnerable customers, it's going to be very important that that level of protection or any scope for change is not such that actually dampens or reduces very important price signals that should really stimulate flexibility, because it's really important that we see not just the supply side of energy markets, but the demand side, because there's so much to gain if we can learn to be much more efficient in the way we use energy. We can consider, everyone always says you can turn your fridge off for an hour, nothing's going to happen, but that might save you a bit of money if the prices are extremely high during that hour. So there are many, many options on the table when we're looking now at how to regulate prices. And of course, we can't just look at that as a short-term problem. It will be a problem that's going to stay. Prices are going to stay high, but it's a problem that we need to harness for the energy transition, because we're all going to have to pay a lot more for our energy. Thank you.
Thank you, Leif, for these first thoughts. I think a really critical question here going forward, the social side of things, of course, with the energy transition, and some important questions you've raised about what that means for market design. Perhaps we can also come back to those a little bit later in the conversation. I hope we have time for it. But for now, let's move forward to a next risk category. And so we'll be speaking now with Tore Sekenes about the business or industrial side of things. And Tore is, of course, squarely placed in the battery industry, and he'll be able to give us a view of the EU's position in this industry and the industry and supply chain risks that can be associated with it. So Tore, please take it away.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that kind introduction, Marie. In the battery industry, I claim that our biggest challenge is actually to exactly meet the very fast-growing demand of lithium-ion batteries with our own European sustainable and resilient battery industry. To explain this, first let's have a look at just how fast this need for batteries is increasing right now. So let's look at the transport sector, electrical vehicles. By looking at that, we get a fairly good view because that represents some 80–90% of the market. Could I have? Yes, thank you very much. So I'll bore you with some data, and if you analyze this slide that I'm showing right now, you will see that that Europe is in fact the biggest single market for EVs, beating Asia, which is essentially China. In 2021, 36% of the global EV market is in Europe, and that you can compare with 20% of the total car market, meaning that we are much stronger on EVs than on other cars, so to say. Also, another detail, in November 2021, that's only a few months ago, 26% of all new cars sold in Europe were in fact plug-in cars. Very few people know that. So looking at the diagrams, clearly visible is the hockey stick effect in 2020 and 2021. And you can also see that China is leading in the number of EVs sold, but Europe is leading in terms of market share. With a continued and even strengthened supportive regulatory framework and accompanied industrial strategies with virtually all of the OEMs, we at the European Battery Alliance, we predict that this accelerated growth will continue for the foreseeable future. Some conclusions. We predict that the few predicted the hockey stick effect in 2020. Now that is a fact. We at EBA, we did predict it, but very few people believed that our estimates when we started the Battery Alliance. Summing up, we are now facing a market growth of almost biblical proportions. Okay, so that's a fact, but do we have a problem? Well, in order to detail that, we need to look at what capacity do we have. So let's have a look at the capacity that at least we know the announced and the up and running industry that we have today. Can I have that? That's the slide I wanted. This is a complicated slide. At the top, you see the value chain. We need to separate into parts. You see from raw materials in one end all the way to recycling in the other end. And you see two dotted lines, one for representing the need in 2025 and the other one for 2030. And you see the numbers on the slide. The columns, the dark blue and the lighter blue, they represent the capacity that we have in 2025 and 2030. So if the columns reached the respective dotted lines, that means that we would be self-sufficient. Concluding on this slide, starting from the positive, let's look at the highest columns. 4 or 5 years ago, there was nothing, or at least precious little battery industry in Europe. Now we know of at least some 50 announced battery cell factories, different projects, and we know that virtually all of the OEMs, the car manufacturers, are well underway to shift to electric drive. If you look at that from an industrial perspective, that must be some kind of a world record in creating new industry in only 5 years. But one glance at the same graph shows you that in the upper end of the value chain and in the lower end, there's a need for much more efforts. So saying that in a positive way, there is ample room for more business and in the upstream segment and in the recycling part of the value chain. So if you're with me that our biggest challenge is in fact to meet this big demand, then I would like to finally bring up 3 things at the top of my wish list for things that we need to unblock in order to make this work. First, for the upstream part, I think this is the most important one: mining, refining, and active materials. Here, the most important part is speeding up the permitting process of mining and refining plants, still ensuring adherence to our high sustainability standards. If this happens, then investments would flow much more naturally into this end of the value chain. Second point, and this applies to the whole value chain, vastly increase and improve the training and schooling of the people that will work in this value chain. And this also includes reschooling of those people in value chains that are in decline. And thirdly, final point on the top of my wish list, it is longer, I would like to bring up something that applies to the uptake of EVs. Ensuring an implementation of a successful charging network throughout Europe so that the vehicles that are being sold will be able to be charged in a convenient way. Those are my 3 points. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tore. Thank you for this wish list. Thank you for this clear illustration of the gap between projected demand and capacity at this point. I think that was all very clear. So I'm going to jump straight from here. We'll come back to these points, I'm sure, later, to a very related factor to the battery sector, which is the question of raw materials. And so here I'd like to ask whether Maria Ostrand can join us. She is, of course, specialized in this particular issue. Could you please tell us about this particular risk and its potential mitigation, which we know is at the top of the European Commission's agenda?
I mean, thanks a lot for the invitation to participate in this meeting. And I agree with the previous speakers that this is a very important topic, so appreciate that. Yes, I can tell a little bit about our thoughts from Northvolt. It's going to be pretty general with the 5 minutes given, but I would basically give you a little bit of view of what we think is the main drivers for the growth that we see and the emergence in Europe. Also what the main challenges are, and of course a proposal on how we can mitigate those or work with those challenges. So looking at, of course, the European value chain and European context and industry, I can see together with you guys that we have a really mature and a very strong automotive industry in Europe that obviously now is driving a very large need of batteries going forward, but also the renewable energy manufacturing going more sustainable with the energy also require quite a lot of ESS, which is a more mature market in for example, the US. But I think in Europe, it's going to be also a growing industry. Also with the European Commission, there is a very strong awareness and high awareness on this and interest to support the energy transition. So this is also something that we see really driving the hockey stick development that Tore mentioned. Also, I think we all are challenged with our targets towards carbon neutrality. And what is really pleasing to see is that quite a lot of companies that drive this transition is currently setting even more ambitious targets than the political ones on their industries. So really seeing this as a competitive edge of the industry. As well, I think we all see an opportunity in Europe with our transparent value chains that we can also offer the OEMs this transparency and the visibility on the raw material value chain, and also establish more sustainable practices in the raw material value chain. I would also like to mention that clearly in some areas in Europe, we have a strong mining tradition. So we should not forget about that, even though I think we have some challenges mentioned earlier here. I think we should also remember our story on that. So that leads us to the challenges a little bit. And I think the permitting process Tore mentioned, that's really definitely one of them. Lack of local investors in Europe is another one. And here we can work a lot together. The battery industry, of course, growing much faster. The automotive industry demanding much faster than the raw material supply is growing. So a really big gap between supply and demand on raw materials. And it is to some extent less attractive to invest in Europe than in some other areas in the world. But if sustainability is on top of mind of everyone, I think that we can make also the European resources and reserves attractive and investment attractive. As well, I think we also see a very strong centralized decision making in Europe, but we see that a lot of local communities are heavily impacted by, for example, mining initiatives. So we see a lot of this in not in my backyard kind of mentality. So that we have something that we have to cope with in Europe. And also we on an overall schedule, we really lack a mining master plan in Europe. If you look at China, who really bought into the positions in Africa and had a very strong strategy and has had for many years, we don't have that in Europe as of now. So that is something that we lack. So that would kind of enter me into my 4 advices on how we can develop and how we can cope with these challenges. I think exactly the same that Tore mentioned. I resonate so well with that one as well. So drive faster, more efficient and clear permitting processes for mining operation. And of course, with uncompromised quality. This is something that we really encourage. Don't make it complex, make it easy for these projects to establish. Also, to a larger extent, attract local investments. We see a lot of non-European investments happening right now in the mining area in Europe. But I think we should also look at what can we do to support and attract local investments in the raw material value chain. I think we should also clearly give projects and companies starting up clear incentives and clear support in driving local establishments. It could be financial support, but it could also be relating to import-exports. It could be CO2 taxes and things like that really drives the local establishment of these projects in Europe and make it cost competitive and sustainably more competitive as well. And of course, for the local communities, so building schemes for sharing benefits beyond just saying that the employment opportunities are established. How do the local communities actually benefit of local establishment of mines? That is something that we must work on much more. That would be my 4 advices.
Thank you, Maria, also for your clarity. Again, a clear wish list going forward in a critical sector. So I will at this point turn over to our final speaker, who I think has been addressed by a number of our panelists to some extent. So Lucas Aranguena is joining us from Santander. And I think all of our panelists in some way, shape or form did mention investments. And so I think that it's great that you can now give us your views on how investment can be geared towards the energy transition and what risks we might see on that pathway. So the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Marie. And thank you for having me together with such a great panel. So indeed,
I guess we're all coming to, we've got great ideas as to how to perform this transition. And I guess the question at the end of the day is going to be, how are we actually going to fund this whole transition? And I think most people focus on two key risks. One is the amount of investment that we're deploying to this transition. That most people say that we need to quadruple or even increase by 8-fold the amount of investment that we perform. A lot of experts would say that we're late into the game. I would agree with that. We're probably 30 to 40 years late into starting this decarbonization and energy transition journey. And I thought I'd actually add a few more challenges and a few more risks, because it's not just about increasing the amount of investment and increasing the speed, that I don't want to downplay. Those two elements are very critical. But we cannot oversee other three potential risks if we don't of not doing this right. The first one is that we need to broaden the technology spectrum. So we've lived in an economy that has been dominated by one single source of energy and materials, and that is being the fossil fuels. And any net zero scenario will bring you to a much more diverse ecosystem in terms of technologies. So we'll need to develop technologies that allow us to perform long duration energy storage, to cope with the intermittency of renewables. We need to electrify heat. We need to build a hydrogen ecosystem, going from green hydrogen production all the way into storage and transmission. We need to finance the whole sustainable materials transformation. We need to go into precision farming. And as investors, we'll need to deploy this money, whether private investors, public investors, or banks, will need to bring a specialization around those technologies. And we actually, within banks, sometimes we struggle because we don't clearly understand what are the technologies that we're investing, and we need to equip ourselves across the whole ecosystem in making sure that we've got, in the finance world, we have technology experts. So I'd like to highlight that as one of the key risks that we're going to be facing in the coming years. The second one is we'll need to increase the investment in earlier stage companies and technologies, and we'll also need to invest in industrializing some of the existing technologies. So fair enough, we know how to finance renewables. We've managed over the last 20 years to make solar and wind even more profitable than fossil fuels when it comes to energy generation. But if there is one thing that we have not developed yet enough in Europe compared to maybe the US market, is we don't have a venture capital early stage investment fully developed. So the reality is that climate tech, to the despair of some VCs, is very capital intensive. So as I tell my banking colleagues, investing in fintech, it's easy, right? So all you need is a few laptops and some software engineers wearing flip-flops and Hawaiian shirts. And there you go, you've got a fintech, right? And if you really want to invest, then you invest into a foosball, or you invest into a ping pong table, right? And then you're good to go, and you're aiming for a unicorn valuation. The reality, however, is that climate tech is very different from other technologies, right? You need equipment, you need labs, you need to do a lot of expensive R&D, and you need to bring those technologies from the lab onto industrial scale to make sure that the unitary costs are efficient and at par with other competing technologies. So it is going to require a lot of investment to achieve that, and we need to fully develop the venture capital and early stage investment in Europe. And the third challenge that I see, in addition to those 2+2 that I've alluded to earlier, is that we will need to engineer a deeper granularity into the system. What do I mean by that? Well, the reality is that the revolution is not just a B2B investment challenge, right? It's not just about project finance. It's not just about venture capital. Some of the decarbonization will need to happen at individual level. Like, for example, decarbonizing buildings, right? It will require a massive degree of granularity to educate and reach the end consumer. So we'll need to introduce an element of B2C financing solutions into the equation, right? If for example I give you another critical example, is going to be farming, right? And sustainable farming. Farming represents 15% of global greenhouse emissions globally. In Europe, we have 10 million farmers. 2/3 of them have less than 5 hectares of farming land. So they're very small entrepreneurs. So we need to make sure that we build a network whereby we can reach those individuals, farmers, owners of small buildings, to make sure that we decarbonize the whole value chain, right? So quite a few challenges ahead of us. I'd like maybe to give you a sense as to how well are we doing, globally and in Europe in terms of addressing this energy transition. On the good news, I'd say that we've achieved a lot over the last 20 years, right? We've seen in 2021, we've seen a massive increase in investment. We've reached 755 billion of investment in 2021. That is a 27% increase versus last year. A lot of that, by the way, has gone onto batteries and gigafactories, and I was enjoying very much listening to Thor and Maria talking, because indeed it has become a huge asset class and is now accounting for 40%. So for you to get a sense, almost half of the investment has gone onto renewables, 40% has gone onto electrifying mobility. However, there are a few challenges here. We are not investing enough in other technologies outside of renewables and electrification of transport. And two, we are not investing enough. So for you to get a sense, first time ever in 2021, China invested more in absolute terms than the European Union in the energy transition, despite the fact that the GDP of the European Union it's higher. So I'll maybe pause here, and maybe we can open for questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Lucas. I wrote down a number of really great points that you made, and a number of numbers as well that I think really show us kind of the scope of the challenge. So thanks very much for that. And we will come back to a number of these points. But before that, I'd like to reach out to some of our other panelists. So let me start with Marco Sedi. So I'd like to go back to the geopolitical side of things for a moment. We've been talking about speed in many of our interventions here, I think, and so I'd like to ask you a question about the speed of things. You were discussing some of the risks of the energy transition, particularly for fossil fuel producers and fossil fuel exporters. So could you give us a little bit of an insight into how fast you think these risks could materialize? How fast will this energy transition unfold, and perhaps kind of comparatively between the EU and other players?
Right. Thank you very much, Marie. I would say that fossil fuel producers have a window of opportunity now, which is reinforced by the high energy prices now. So countries like Russia and again, Algeria and Norway, the producers are making quite a lot of money at the moment, thanks to high prices. And I've seen some forecasts according to which this situation might last for, in the midterm at least. So it's a good time now to think about investments for them. However, the time will be different depending on which partner we are thinking of. For example, if we think of Russia, then there is more leeway in the sense that it is more competitive in the shrinking market of fossil fuels compared to, for instance, Algeria. So it's a lot about how what decisions will be made in the next 10 years, really, because then after 10 years we will see sustained decrease in consumption, also of less polluting fossil fuels like gas. And after 2030, alternative markets, for example, in Asia, are also predicted to stop growing. So it won't be easy to diversify anymore. And of course, a lot depends also on the speed of the actual transition in the global north. So the EU has had very ambitious plans, but we are still not completely sure about, for example, there is a whole debate now about the inclusion of gas projects in the taxonomy. So even within Europe, it's not fully clear how fast the continent will proceed on the road, on the path to the energy transition.
Thank you, Marco, for these thoughts, differentiating indeed between the different producers. So at this point, I'd like to go back as well to Lei Hanker. And so we were talking earlier about the current state of gas and electricity prices in the EU. And there's been proposals by several member states to overhaul the market design to ensure that gas-fired power plants no longer set the wholesale prices for electricity. Do you feel that this overhaul should take place?
Thank you. Well, that's, of course, a great question and something that ACER, the Agency for the Cooperation of Energy Regulators, is currently looking at to advise the Commission as to what changes are needed. I think certainly ACER and many commentators have agreed that we shouldn't change the current pay-as-clear system. So that's where in fact, currently the gas-fired generators set the market price. There are various reasons why that is seen as the best method, partly to encourage the investment that we need to finance the transition. We've heard quite a lot about that from the previous speakers. So I doubt that we'll see a recommendation, certainly from ACER, to change the system so dramatically. But I think what we need is to look at where the gaps are in the current system. And we have what we call an energy-only market. So it's not easy to reward new investment. The price signal is really the only signal that we have to encourage new investors to come in to the European market. And so I think that a lot more consideration will have to be given to designing new instruments, hedging instruments, for example, that will make it more attractive and give more investment stability and signals to encourage more investors to come in, and at the same time ensure that consumers are not exposed to endless price spikes. I think that will be one of the big challenges. Thanks.
Thank you, Lei. A very important challenge, I think, at the top of many political agendas. So thanks for that. And again, we will come back to the investment point in just a moment, but I'd like to make a stop by the battery industry. And so, Tore, could I perhaps ask you a little bit more about the predictions and the forecasts that you were addressing? So you spoke about a forecast that then turned out to surpass realities. You spoke about new forecasts. How reliable do you feel the indications currently are about the direction of the battery industry? What might influence those projections going forward? The floor is yours.
I think we are clearly in a very dynamic phase of the development right now. So it's probably it is very difficult to make forecasts. I'll give that excuse, but it is a fact that in my work over the last 3-4 years, we have not found a report or forecast that has surpassed reality up until now. Maybe that happens in the future, but up until now, they are all too conservative. And that might be because we are in this dynamic situation. I add on a conclusion on that. The fact that we have these predictions saying that things will go slower than they're actually going right now makes it difficult to plan. and it makes it difficult to see what is going on. But I would like to point out one thing. It is actually, I hope I left the message that it's actually difficult to get the capacity that we need. And so the conclusion I draw is that the flavor of the day in the industry should be cooperation rather than competition. We will get at a steady state to a normal competition situation, but I think we need to do more cooperation across country borders, across companies, across the value chain, and so on and so forth, in order to meet this gigantic need. Thank you.
Thank you, Tore, for insights from a growing industry and how those different phases might continue to evolve. I will take it from here to go to Maria. But before I do, I am seeing some questions already coming in via the chat. So to our audience, please feel free to continue sending those in. We will start to address them in just a moment. But Maria, going to you. So you've been speaking about raw materials and how access to these raw materials from whatever source they may come from may pose challenges to the growth of the European battery industry. So could you elaborate a little bit further about how this industry can continue to develop while also taking into account these challenges? Maria, you're muted still.
Sorry for that. Yes, the challenge is there. If you talk about the battery industry or even further downstream, the automotive industry, clearly the challenge is there to secure batteries with European materials. And that will be a challenge for a long foreseeable future if we were ever be fully sustainable or fully fed by European raw materials. I guess quite a lot of people can question if that is even possible long term. But I think that what we can do to support is really to all the way throughout the value chain ask for locally sourced, or maybe more important, sustainably sourced raw material. So we bring down the CO2 footprint of the full cell. And it's, I mean, interesting to know that the raw materials in a cell, all the CO2 that we add throughout the value chain of that raw material, it corresponds to approximately 50% of the CO2 footprint of the full cell. So if you can do this in more sustainable ways with renewable energy, of course you can add a lot to the total CO2 footprint of the cell. And then of course CO2 is only one measure of the sustainability, but talking about that specifically. I don't know if it answered your question, but...
Well, I'm sure we could continue talking about this for a very long time, and so that's certainly one aspect that we'll take into account. And I think that perhaps we'll have a few more things coming in through also our audience questions in just a moment. So we'll come back to some of these points, I imagine. So at this stage, I'd like to hand it over to Lucas Aranguena, and basically coming back to the challenge of financing the transition. I know that you said that the size of the investment is only one of the elements, but it is one of the elements. It's also clear that we're going to need all stakeholders involved here, private and public, contributing. So would you care to elaborate on the role of public and private investors in this space, or perhaps pick up on any of the points that some of our speakers may have made regarding the price signals and where investments need to go to? That's welcome as well, of course.
Sure. Now, let me maybe comment on both very quickly, right? I think there are 4 key things that will need to happen if we want to really sustain the investment that is going to be needed into the energy transition. One will be to develop new financial instruments and products. I believe there is going to be a very significant innovation that is going to come out of the financial system in order to fund the energy transition. We are already experimenting some of that, and there will be a lot of transversal co-creation, not only within the financial system itself, but also together with clients and with lenders. The development of the voluntary carbon market that is going to be very much needed. And we will need a carbon market that is robust, that is transparent, that is verifiable, and that is environmentally robust. and that will have a massive impact as well into sustaining the financing of the transition. We'll need to get much better at pricing the externalities as well. So at the end of the day, financial investors, they invest because they get a return that is higher than their cost of capital. And the problem is that until very recently, and even today, investors didn't have to pay the burden of the cost of the externalities that those investments were encompassing, right? So they were getting artificially high returns. So let me give you a number. If the fossil fuel industry were to be be charged for the externalities they created, that would account up to $3 trillion per annum, right? Which means that we would be wiping out the profits of the oil and gas sector altogether. So we need to get much better at really, subsidizing the right elements and do pricing the externalities. And indeed, to your point, we will need to deploy public monies and also philanthropic monies at a scale. And that will be very much needed during the early days of the transition, so early into this decade. And why is that? Because it's the public money and the philanthropic monies that actually allow us to develop new technologies. That's the stage at which most investors don't want to participate because the risk is very high. And that is a very important role that governments need to play with government R&D grants, for example, or R&D loans, and is the role also of the philanthropic world. For you to get a sense, out of the whole philanthropic industry, so to speak, or investments annually, only 2% is done into climate tech or any form of of energy transition. 2% is very low, and I'd like to see that growing massively. So when it comes to government support or philanthropic monies, we'd probably need to see a 5-fold increase on both to sustain the energy transition. So a lot needs to happen still.
Thank you, Lucas. I had the feeling that may be a conclusion of the full panel, but that is a process we're engaged in. So thank you for your insights there. Let me start to take some questions from our audience here. And so a first question that I'd like to bring in is from Cesar Lanza. I think this might be a question that Leigh could perhaps address, perhaps somebody else, if they'd like to join in as well, please go ahead. The question is whether the behavior of electricity markets at present puts at risk the 2030 objectives for decarbonization. Leigh, do you have any thoughts on that? I think you may be muted.
I'd probably say the opposite, right? I'd probably say the opposite. We are experiencing historic energy prices today. And this means that some technologies that last year were not economical are actually becoming economical, right? This is really fascinating, right? And the good thing about renewables is that when you set up a wind or a solar farm, you know pretty much to the decimal point what's going to be the cost per megawatt hour, right? When you build a coal plant, when you build a gas plant, you actually are exposed to spot prices on your feedstock, right? So if anything, I would say that it would help. I don't think it's going to be the one driver that is going to accelerate the energy transition, though, but it's definitely not harmful. It can only help. I don't know if any of the other panelists would like to complement or maybe disagree with my views.
It's certainly an issue, I think, at the heart of many, many debates right now. Perhaps we can move forward to some other questions that are coming in from our audience. And there's an interest here with regard to raw materials and the question of self-sufficiency. So we have a question coming in about what degree of self-sufficiency the EU could plausibly attain when it comes to raw materials such as lithium, nickel, and manganese. Maria or Marco, might you have some insights into this issue?
I think that we should be phrasing this pretty bluntly. I think the battery industry is already coming into play, so already producing in Europe, but there is no raw material production in Europe as of today. So I think clearly it's not self-sustaining in Europe, let's say. And I think if we look ahead if the forecasted production of battery in Europe will be realized and materialized, there is no chance that that will be fed by European raw materials as of today. But I think that should only be a carrot for the European projects to develop, and that should also bring investors into understanding that there is very little risk in investing in this part of the value chain. The need is enormous. And if we can focus on the importance of supplying green, sustainable raw materials with full traceability and transparency in the value chain, and that is requested by customers, I think there is also a long industry building up going forward.
Thank you, Maria. I think Marco and then Tore.
Yes, I agree. The EU does not have enough resources, and this is why the recent efforts have focused on trying to securing supply chains. If we think about the raw material strategy, so it's a challenge for the EU, but it's not a new one because the EU did not have fossil fuels either. So in a way, we are not adding more issues. I mean, not sufficient, of course, fossil fuels. So we are not adding new issues. It's a similar situation, and this reinforces my point about, transforming existing energy relations in a way that, for example, instead of importing gas or oil from North Africa, you import green hydrogen, for instance. And the same applies to Russia. So it is there as a challenge, but it can be dealt with. And diplomacy, green diplomacy, will be essential to support current efforts and new ones.
Thank you, Marco. Tore, would you like to add to this?
Yes, I would like to add to Maria's comments, which are very correct. And that one little detail here is that the raw materials we need actually are under our feet. Most of it can be, if we wanted to, can be extracted here in Europe. I'm sure there are exceptions, but a lot of it could be if we wanted to. So it comes down to our willingness to do it here in Europe. And then we come back to permitting. And I didn't say in my 5 minutes the public acceptance to doing it. So if we wanted to, and I advocate that we should, we can get it from European soil and do it sustainable, traceably, and all that good stuff. But it comes down to our willingness. Maybe you want to comment that, Maria.
Please do, Maria.
May I? Yeah, and it actually resonates with the question that I can also see in the chat around what else is in the bucket for the local community except for job opportunities or employment opportunities. And I think it's quite a lot. I mean, if we build an industry in communities that doesn't have this industry before, of course, it drives employment opportunity, but it also drives people moving in due to that. And that, of course, drives the whole build and development of the economy of the local community. And this is not a less advanced industry. This is really an industry driving high-tech equipment, high-tech technology. A lot of computational expertise is needed, and it's pretty education heavy, to be honest. Except, I mean, apart from what you might think about when you talk about mining. So I think it also will drive up the education level and drive up the demand on really highly skilled, highly trained and educated people. And of course, that drives again up the salaries of these people. And then I think we should also enforce the local incentives for the communities. So how can we help the communities to get a decent share of the upside if we establish mining. Of course, the infrastructure will be developed, but what also comes down to the people living in the surrounding areas is very, very important. I think we can talk about all of that and really paint a more colorful picture, I think. But we should also make sure that we talk about mining as a sustainable industry with very advanced methods and methodologies and technologies. And we should not, of course, destroy a landscape. It should be something that is left behind, looking nice, being restored and refurbished in a decent way, so we don't leave big holes in the ground after doing these kind of intrusions, which it is actually intrusions in the ground.
Thank you, Maria. Terry, would you like to add a final point to this?
Yeah, I totally agree with what Maria is saying. Public acceptance is crucial here. I think the first question in the chat was regarding, made reference to an article in Der Spiegel. I didn't read that, but I know what is in that type of article. And I think it's the perception of all the mistakes. And there are, God knows that there are many mistakes made in mining. The perception that that is what we are going to have if we have mining here is actually stopping the process. So we have to be extremely transparent and extremely respectful that we in fact meet our high set standards on sustainability. When people trust that, then we can unlock this. So public perception, permitting, ensuring sustainability, fundamental to make this work.
Thank you, Tere. Perhaps I'll pick up on this, and to some extent, I mean, we're now speaking about local acceptability, public acceptability, but I think there is a related point to some extent, which goes towards investment. And so we know that information is, of course, key when it comes to investments and mitigating risks. And so I'd like to ask Lucas whether you could perhaps let us know about how investors currently are discriminating between investments, between how green they are, so to speak. Could you elaborate a little bit on this point? You're on mute, sorry.
Sorry for that. So no, it's a very good point, and I think this is where we've sophisticated the market quite significantly over the last few years. There is much more information that needs to be reported onto the capital markets. So for you to get a sense, the financial sector has created a net zero banking alliance, whereby we need to comply with certain standards when we issue or invest green or sustainable products, right? And this is all regulated. More regulation will come into place. And a lot of investors are taking this as a reference, as a very important reference when deploying their capital, right? And what we're seeing is that the demand for sustainable or sustainability-linked assets, it's only growing. For you to get a sense, out of all the bonds issued in 2021, 25% were sustainability-linked. We expect that number, and it was only 10% a couple of years ago. So the market, the green bond market and the sustainability-linked market is increasing quite significantly. And what we see is that the demand for those type of assets is growing. So order books are typically 3.6 to 4 times oversubscribed compared to 3 times on normal bonds. That's one, and that investors are willing to pay a premium for those type of assets, right? So there is typically, a premium of around, anywhere between 2 to 5 basis points on those assets, and these will only increase going forward. Clearly, investors are going to take a much closer look as to how they deploy their monies, making sure that whatever assets they hold on their books are sustainable and green, and there is a whole range of evidence and facts that will need to be that needs to be provided to ensure that. Effectively, you could argue that maybe in 10 years in Europe, companies will not be able to issue a bond if it's not sustainability linked or green, right? It's a bit of a provocation what I'm saying here, but there isn't a scenario in which that could happen. There isn't a scenario in which companies now are very fearful of issuing profit warnings. We will see, as in order to issue those bonds, companies need to report on their CO2 and their energy transition and decarbonization targets over time. We will see the massive effect that some not profit warnings, but CO2 warnings, because they are not complying to the targets that they have self-imposed, is going to have on their stock price and the price of their bonds. So again, I was alluding earlier to the whole, innovation that is going through the financial markets that is phenomenal, and is gonna discriminate the green from the brown, and is gonna price in, and investors are becoming much more intelligent as to pricing correctly those two type of assets.
Thank you, Lucas. Again, something that is going to be high on the agenda going forward, no doubt. So I'm going to wrap up here with the final question we are getting from the audience. And again, this was a session about energy security amid new and traditional risks. One of those traditional risks is geopolitical relations and gas relations, particularly with Russia. And so we do have a question coming in on how the EU can manage its risks with natural gas, particularly in the case of Nord Stream 2 and relations with Russia. So I'll give that to Marco first, and then to Lei.
Right, so this is a very relevant question, and it's also a very politicized one, because if you're following the current crisis, some argue that Nord Stream 2 should be used as a lever vis-a-vis Russia in the current crisis. So I would say that in the very short run, Nord Stream 2 won't play a role because well, first of all, because the certification process is not over, and secondly, because it's also not really in Russia's interest to pump more gas at this moment. At the moment, what Russia is saying is Europe wanted this market based on spot prices. Now we also play according to these rules, which means that there is less gas, so we pump less, but we make more money. But coming to the long term and the role of Nord Stream 2, the pipeline is now built. A lot of money went into it, also from in terms of European guarantees. So the question is what to do next, and we can imagine that in a market similar to the one before the energy crisis, Nord Stream 2 could play a role in keeping prices lower and replacing dwindling European gas production. For example, in the Netherlands. In the long term, however, as Europe decarbonizes, so gas will probably be the last fossil fuel to be phased out because it's the least polluting. At the same time, I believe that Europe should insist on something that was brought up by the Russian counterparts, which is that in the future, the pipeline could also be used for hydrogen exports. It could be repurposed for hydrogen exports. So this, again, is part of the argument I was making before of transforming the energy relations with key partners towards more sustainable lines. And Nord Stream 2 could become part of this picture in the ideal scenario, at least.
Thank you for thinking forward with this one as well. Lei, would you like to follow up on these points?
Thank you. Yes, I think I would echo those sentiments. And I think also it's a heavily politicized debate, but it's interesting to think, well, what's going to be the alternative? Because, of course, one of the issues is that Poland wants to continue its long-term contracts for gas with Russia, which will, I believe, the current one expires in 2024. So they want the leverage. So for Europe as a whole, I wonder how much less dependent on Russia we will be if Nord Stream 2 is stopped or put on hold again, because it's a question of looking at alternative routes, and that I think should not be overlooked. So the main objective of those who've objected to NS2 has been to keep that other supply route open, but it's still Russian gas. So I think in the overall picture, we need to consider whether Nord Stream 2 will achieve what many, or closing it down, will that really achieve less dependence on Russia? I'm not sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Lei. Thank you to everyone, in fact, of the panel, because we have covered so many interesting topics, which I think each of which could have had their own panel discussion. So I think we've just opened the door. Hopefully we can continue to these conversations through other channels or further sessions as well. We've covered geopolitical risks, the energy transition for fossil fuel producers. We've talked about contracts and market design in the context of the energy transition, price signals and investment, and the investment that is needed and how to direct it to where it's needed. We've talked about the battery industry, demand, capacity, and how to make sure that we fill the gap between the two, as well as social factors, employment factors. So I don't think we could have been more complete, honestly. I think we've talked about a number of really fascinating topics, and I really want to thank you for your expert insights for all of these points. So thanks again to our panelists. I'll also go ahead and thank our audience online for their questions, for their comments, as well as our supporters in this event, InnoEnergy and the European Commission. I'll just wrap up then, inviting our audience also to join us once again on Thursday for the final session of our Global Annual Energy Day. And that's going to be on the external dimension of Fit for 55, namely the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Looking forward to seeing you then. Thank you to everyone, and we'll sign off here.